delighted to welcome Ramona with us. I wish we were there in person, or wish you were here in person, but hopefully it will be a really invigorating session. Nonetheless, we're all used to this now, so this is the norm. But Ramona, for those that don't know her, I'm going to get her to introduce herself in a minute, but she has just jumped on board here at LSE as our Entrepreneur-in-Residence for this year. And you'll soon hear why we're absolutely delighted to be working with her. We're trying not to hog her all to ourselves, and we're going to try and offer you guys some time to glean some kind of wisdom and knowledge from her, and just her enthusiasm for the impact space and all things related. So what we thought we'd do today is have a really informal chat, but really give you guys a chance to ask any questions, to find out more about Ramona, and share anything with her. But just, yeah, rather than a kind of a lecture style thing, which no one really wants on a Friday in lockdown in winter, and we're going to try and make it as interesting and fun as possible. So welcome everyone, and more importantly, welcome Ramona. Ramona, as I said, do you want to just introduce yourself and give us a bit of a whirlwind tour of your career to date?
Sure, I'm happy to, LJ, and it's a real pleasure. Thanks everyone for turning up today. And as LJ says, this really should be a chat amongst all of us. And I don't know what wisdom I might impart, but I have had a fair bit of experience around the entrepreneurial space, which I'll talk about a bit. So I've really had a career in two halves. The first half was spent basically helping multinational companies with strategic issues and also with innovation. And one of the things I realized as I was working with companies as diverse as Microsoft or PepsiCo or HSBC or Vodafone was, first of all, the world's a very big place with countries in very, very different stages. And secondly, there wasn't a whole lot of innovation going on in the most important things in the world. So what are now known as the Sustainable Development Goals, but which everyone could have just thought of as like, well, healthcare systems, education, clean energy, infrastructure, you name it. So the second half of my career, basically about 10 years ago, I joined a startup that was trying to connect the bottom billion, the poorest billion, to mobile. We'd now be at a point where we're trying to connect them to smartphones. Many of them have got some kind of digital access, but there's still a very big digital divide in the world. But that got me hooked on the whole area of kind of global impact tech and investing. And over the last 10 years, I've been lucky enough to be both an investor myself, both in a personal capacity with groups of others and for a corporate that was specializing in clean energy investing. I've actually run an accelerator for nearly 80 fast growth companies in East Africa and South Asia, which was phenomenal. And I've just recently, after a period of time working on natural capital and environmental financing, I've just joined a small but mighty boutique called Roots of Impact. And we're basically helping spend public money in much smarter ways to address things like climate smart agri-tech, basically to support impact entrepreneurs and get them funded. We'll talk quite a lot more about why this has been a challenge and why we need kind of new systems to do this. But thanks very much for having me, LJ, both today and in general with the LSE.
Brilliant. No, thank you. Guys, if you have any questions, please just pop them into the chat bot and I'll bring them in as and when. And if you want to just say it out loud, put in that weird virtual hand thing up and I'll come to you. Also weird. So Ramona, just to kind of clarify then, just in terms of your investment experience, did you get into general investing before you moved into impact, or did you go straight in? And what was the difference if you did?
I mean, in a way, I started investing before the term impact investing was a thing. But I always knew that, you know, what's known as your investment thesis, or the things that you want to invest in, always had a component that was much, much bigger than purely commercial. So I looked for founders, even in the first investments that I made, and I've now got about 18 companies that I'm invested in as an angel that are still around, and some of them are actually even growing, which is great. But all the companies had, and we'll talk a little bit more about specifics, but they all basically had founders who wanted to solve a big problem that meant something. They weren't in the classic Silicon Valley model of disruption. They didn't just want to come in and destroy something. They actually wanted to build something that needed building. And I think even before I was conscious that I was an impact investor, this was still very much in my mind. I just didn't find it very interesting to have businesses that all they were doing was digitalizing something that existed, or where it was very clear all they wanted to do was just get in, make a quick buck and get out.
Yeah. And so in terms of kind of what you would actually define an impact business, then you kind of mentioned some of the things, but what would you say would be the key characteristics and the kind of commitments for a founder working in impact?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is every business is an impact business. So I might clarify it and say, what do you need to be a net positive impact business? So the fact of the matter is a lot of technology has been treated as if it is ethically neutral. That any tech is good and it's much, much more efficient by default and fairer and better. And that's simply not the case. So a positive impact business is two things to me. One is it has a real problem in mind. And by that, I do not mean faster laundry, faster burritos. I don't mean making things faster and easier for the wealthy to get to. That is not a real problem. It may be something people are willing to pay for. That does not make it a problem. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff that has been funded falls into that category, and funded at sometimes very large amounts. The second thing it has is that it has to be serving a group of people who have historically been overlooked or underserved. The good news is that's the majority of people. So much innovation has really been targeted at the 1% or the 5% in the world. And this also means that a lot of these propositions are potentially globally applicable. But even if you think about things like innovation in shelter or housing, you could also see it working for broad groups within a population, as well as those who are poor. So the final thing about an impact business is it often involves a combination of business models, some of which may cross-subsidize the others.
Brilliant. And so, I mean, I can see in the Zoom windows, there's quite a few of us who are about to launch or are have already actually. I can see a couple have launched. But for those that are considering this direction, what do you think they should be thinking about when they're setting up an impact business? What are the key things?
I think the first thing to say is don't say I'll get to it later. Let me build a business and then I'll figure out what its impact is going to be. If you bake it into the business from the beginning, that will affect everything that you do, who you hire, who you get investment from, how long you will take to get to sort of product market fit, where you will operate, maybe what your costs will be. It's really, really, really important to not see impact as like a thing on top that you'll get to when you have time. Then it's not an impact business. Then it's just a business with maybe some ideas about how to do it better. But it will also be very difficult if you don't start out as you mean to go on with the right kind of capital and the right sort of principles and the right sort of team. You can't really pivot back to it. And I've seen a lot of wannabe impact businesses in my life who kind of have a vague idea that they'll do something good, but never really get around to it.
Yeah, that is key. And you talked about capital, and if we can just maybe explore just for a few minutes the funding models for an impact business, because this is always something that comes up with students, and I think you'd have a hopefully really helpful answer with that.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, the funding model is not any different from any other business, right? I think what's more important than the funding model is to understand the business model that you will have. So, for example, if you are going to be serving a large proportion of people who are poor or may not have the resources to pay for a good quality service, you'll have to think of some other funding to cover that gap. So you'll either have to think of a two-tier pricing structure. It will probably also take you longer to develop your business model and your product market fit because these are complex challenges that are not easy to solve. So you may have to, in a way, find yourself some more money for a longer runway. The most important thing is it's not so much, saying, do you go to a bank? Do you go to friends and family? Do you go to investors? Do you go to VC? Each of them have different criteria for lending. It's more a question of how much money will you need, by when, for what, and to make sure that you give yourself adequate and well-aligned capital. What you don't want to do is go pitch a VC and say, hey, we're going to do something great for the 1%. And then, a year in say, actually, what we always wanted to do was to serve the poorest. That's not going to meet their criteria. You're going to end up in a whole heap of trouble. And this does actually happen. So, the question of patient aligned capital is a really, really important one if you're serious about building an impact business. And that starts from the very, very beginning.
Yeah, I love that phrase. Are there any questions just off the back of that one? Because I know that was a big question. Or anything so far? Yeah, Alice.
I have a question. Hey. Hi, Ramona. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Alice.
How do you know when an investor is right for you?
That's an excellent question. I mean, investors are not blank slates, right? The good thing about them is that they come with history and they come with a portfolio. So I think of it a bit like dating, right? Everybody might these days Google the person they're about to go out with and see what's out there. Similarly, investors will have a track record. It's really important to know what an investor invests in. I'm actually amazed by the number of people who approach me with, I don't know, femtech or lipstick businesses when I've made it very clear I invest in climate tech. So, that kind of mismatch is easily avoidable. But I think equally important is, what does the investor like to work with? And there, it's perfectly acceptable to go and speak to some of the companies they've invested in and see what they're like. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of investors out there who don't add a tremendous amount of value and can be a tremendous sort of drag on your business. And people don't tend to think enough about the nature of that relationship, given that it lasts often a decade or more. For your earliest investors, you want to be very, very careful about who you've got with you during that time.
Thank you. Thanks, Alice, for the question. And Carolina, I can see your awkward hand up.
Yes, thank you for the question. Thank you, Ramona. My question is, do you believe that impact investors are expecting the same return on capital than traditional investments? And if you believe that this is possible, that the social vendors compete with traditional business?
It's such a good question. So there was always a misperception that anytime you brought the word impact near something, it was a bit like if you say European about something in the US, it means it's expensive, and impact somehow means that it's, we'll never make any money. It's completely mistaken. There is a similar range of return on investment for impact investing, sometimes a superior return on investment than there is for ordinary investing. But there's a caveat here, which I'll come to. So some of this is about sectors. So for example, the prospects in oil and gas, you may have noticed, are not too bright recently. And yet a lot of the money that is going into oil and into renewable energy has been termed impact investing, when in fact, all it was smart investing, recognizing the way that the market was going to go. And it happened to be green on top, right? So there's no way to really compare that kind of impact investing with investing in, say, a social enterprise looking to hire people who've come out of prison, right? It's going to have a very, very different business model. It's probably going to require quite a lot of time to get going, and it may require a bunch of subsidy or philanthropic input. So part of the problem we have is a definition problem. Is like, what actually is impact? Well, it's anything that is net positive, but certain net positive markets are much, much more mature than others. And can deliver the same or superior returns. Others do not yet have a functioning investment market around them, or are not yet valuing things like externality or value created. Because, for example, if you had an easy way in that social enterprise to value the impact you're creating by preventing people from having to go back into prison, so if you were able to monetize that through things like a bond, you could actually argue that you would easily be able to match a conventional investment, and you would do it at lower risk. So I think this whole question basically of like, can impact ever pay off? Absolutely, but not in every case. And there's a lot of unpriced risk in the market that actually flatters the profile of a lot of investment that is not impact. I hope that helps. I know it's a big question. We could get into more nuanced around certain kinds of businesses and certain kinds of investments, but don't ever let anyone tell you, short answer, that impact investing is inherently lower margin or for suckers.
Thank you. Grant, I saw your hand up.
Thank you so much for doing this, Ramona. I was wondering what all you would suggest before approaching investors, especially if you're at like sort of a preliminary stage, if it's appropriate maybe to like reach out to people who are more familiar with the industry that you're in, if you're feeling a bit stuck.
So is the question when to approach an investor?
I guess investor, but also like, is it possible if you have a revenue model, but you don't have like everything quite built out, to approach them as more of like a, like helping you along the way?
So investors invest at different stages, right? So there are some investors, seed investors, who invest in a business when it has a prototype, when it has a little bit of traction, a little bit of, proof of concept, something like that. It's not a business until the point at which you have customers and revenue. So if you have an idea, I would say then it is too early to approach an investor, any investor, because truthfully, we all have much, much more to digest than we can handle. And there was a sort of horrifying statistic that showed that pitch decks were typically read for no more than 3.1 minutes when they were sent in cold by somebody. There's just too much. So I would say be respectful of the person's time. They are not there to help businesses get off the ground. They are there to evaluate whether or not this business is a good fit for their particular thesis, and whether or not it would make a good investment for them. Otherwise, it's just taking up a busy person's time without a lot of value to be generated in either direction. Luckily, there's a whole lot more people to give help than there are investors. There's tons of mentors. I've been a mentor at one time on 14 different accelerator programs, all unpaid. It's now only 6, I think. But, you know, there's a lot of other people out there who aren't investors who can help at that very, very early stage and are far more set up to do so.
Are there any other questions around investment just before we move on to, and we can always come back if you think of a question, it's not a problem. No, okay, should we go to Jeru's question, Ramona, which is around, actually she hasn't told us what it's around. Surprise us.
Surprise.
Bring it on.
Thanks, Ramona. Just to give you some background, so I'm launching a company that's looking to bring in sustainability in the footwear space for kids. So there's many ways in which I can approach sustainability, right? There's the design of the shoes and the material I use. There is the working conditions and the supply chain and how I manage that. There's the education piece, which I'm looking to tackle, you know, in terms of helping young kids who are my end customers, recognize what the challenges are that we're facing in the planet, and helping them feel empowered. And there's so many more things that you can tackle in this space. And I guess my question to you is, as an early startup, how do you think about the various challenges you can take on, and then how do you build a roadmap for building in more elements around impact into your business, and how do you sort of storyboard that for investors?
Yep, it's such a good question. I'm so glad you asked that. And by the way, I love what you're doing in your business. I was a part of the group that sort of looked at these businesses, and I just thought that's fantastic. So I think the very first thing to say to yourself is, what can we do that nobody else can do? Or what can we do better that nobody else can do? And I think there are things like education fall outside of scope, especially in the early days. I mean, you're not an education business, you're a footwear business. So, to the extent that, of course, you want to keep your brand consistent and you want to make sure all your collateral is in line, fine, but don't take on the mantle of educating the population when your job is there to make a shoe. But I also think in terms of the triple bottom line of environmental, social, and governance, that is absolutely where you should put the emphasis. And as a manufacturing business that's probably going to have a multinational supply chain, that's the bit that you want to get right from the very beginning, because then and only then can you be very clear about the cost of doing business and be very clear to investors what they're signing up for if they want to support you in the highest quality and most responsible way of doing business. What would be very difficult to do, again, is to reverse out of a supply chain that you've done in order to be expedient, and then try and build sustainability back into it. It just won't work. So start out with kind of the highest integrity supply chain that you can, and you may actually find that will give you not only competitive advantage and competitive knowledge, but also a pricing premium as people begin to realize the risks of unsustainable supply chains. I mean, I think that journey started with the collapse of Rana Plaza and has gone on from there. But, people will actually start to reward you and give you a premium for that if they're an aligned patient capital investor. If they're not, and they just want to invest in like the next celebrity-backed footwear brand, they're not right for you anyway.
Yeah.
So I hope that helps.
That does. Yeah. Thank you very much. That's really nice.
Thanks, Ramona. Thanks, Drew, for the question. There's one in the chat from Nakul around financial inclusion. So how would you define it, and how is it different from other sectors of impact investing? Do you understand that question?
No, I'm not sure I do. So maybe I should just hear the question more directly.
Yeah, Nicole, do you want to explain what you mean?
Yeah, thanks, LJ, for organizing this session, and thanks, Ramona, for being here. So, Ramona, I wanted to understand, how the financial inclusion is different from any other sector of investing into other sectors of renewable energy, or maybe infrastructure. So like as in we are a platform, we are working towards we want to facilitate investments into developing countries.
Yep.
So we wanted to understand like should we focus on one particular sector by providing access to finance to one particular sector of economy, but or should we be generalized in starting by taking our approach?
Yep. Of course. And I've done a lot of work around financial inclusion. So I understand where the question's coming from. I come back to this question of what can you do that no one else can do? Anyone can set up a digital platform pretty much to try and connect money from one place to another. But there has to be a kind of thesis that you have around whose financial inclusion you are going for and why. And I'll give a couple of examples of that. There's a great, one of my former colleagues has started a business in Bangladesh called iFarmer, which is basically around getting crowdfunding for farms. And making sure to cut out the middleman. And, that is a form of financial inclusion. But he's being very, very deliberate about the crops that he's chosen, about the regions that he's supporting, and about the pitch. So it can be very single-minded. Going a different direction, you could actually, there are plenty of businesses out there that are trying to do financial inclusion for things like, groups of people left out, either because of places. I mean, many of you probably know there's very, very few bank branches in much of the world. People don't have a bank account, they don't have a credit record. So there's a lot of solutions out there for digital financial inclusion to give people an alternative credit score, for example, for mobile phones, or to provide them with effectively a mobile wallet that allows them to have the equivalent of a bank account. But a generic proposition for financial inclusion for a startup is a disaster, because then your cost of acquisition of a new client is very, very high, and your ability to compete in the market is very, very low. So while the goal of financial inclusion is a good one, the question would be, what is it that you can do, that you understand, that your segment that you can start with, your need that you can start with, that you don't think anyone else is going to do well? And until you answer that question, you may not be able to make it, as effectively toward that goal of financial inclusion as you would like. I hope that makes sense.
Sure. Got it. Got an answer. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks for the question. Ileana, really nice to see you. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much, Ramona. My question is about, let's say, you have your idea, you're drafting it, right? But at some point, we all know that you cannot do it by yourself. So at some point, you need to look for co-founders. So I guess, and to tell you honestly, me also being a coach, sometimes I also mentor some startups, and I deal sometimes with co-founders, and you realize that in reality, the picture is not very rosy sometimes. So like, what would be your advice? I suppose maybe one is like, at which stage should you be looking for a co-founder? That's one. And secondly, like, what are maybe the key attributes or, things that you really need to make sure that, co-founder has generally?
Yep. So great question. So I would say as early as possible. Like, this is not a solitary sport. It's a team sport. And especially if you actually want to get anyone to back your business, it's a good sign if you're able to show that several of you at the very outset share the vision. And also that the resources of the company and responsibilities of the company are fairly distributed. So look for a co-founder or a couple of co-founders as early as you possibly can. And in terms of what makes it work, I mean, co-founder dynamics, books have been written, operas have been written, lots and lots of other things could be written, tragedies, comedies, theater plays. But I would say that the most important thing that they must share is your vision and your values. Right. So they have to have a very aligned view of the world. But then the thing they shouldn't share is your skill set. And probably the biggest mistake that I see, and you probably do as a coach as well, is that people tend to gravitate toward people who feel like them. But actually that's harmful, because what you really want is someone who complements, you want one or two people who really complement the skills the business needs, and to be very, very clear about the competencies, the skills, and so on. So no divergence of values, and a significant divergence in skills and personality is probably desirable. That's the quickest sort of capsule answer I can give to that one, because I could probably talk about it all day.
Thank you. And Carolina, you're on a roll. Go for it.
Thank you. My question is about, Ramona, the measurement of impact, because I know that it's not only about saying that you are making an impact, it's about being able to demonstrate that. And I know that there are several frameworks to measure impact. So I don't know, lean data, the social development goals,
yep, all of that. Mm-hmm.
So my question is, I believe that it has two parts. In first part, if you prefer some particular framework, or if you believe that it's one mainstream framework. And in second part, I know that there are a lot of companies that are using the social development goals to do like a rainbow washing, similar to a greenwash washing. So how to differentiate when a company is really making an impact or is using the social development goals just to say that they are having an impact?
Actually, I don't agree that companies are using the SDGs. I'll tell you why. I'll start with that second half of the question. If you look below the level of the 17 goals, there are bullet points below, and they are very, very specific. So no company that signs up to a very, very specific thing can actually be rainbow washing, because they actually have to have done something that's measurable. So I understand if they're just using that like nice flag and saying we work on SDG 3, 5, and 7, that's fine. But the minute you go one level below that is where that keeps you honest. So, I think we should all try and hold companies accountable. If they say they're doing something, for example, on gender, to say, what exactly? Are you working on 7.2.1? Are you working on 7.4.2? What exactly are you doing? And I also encourage impact founders to be as specific as possible on their decks as to which the primary and secondary focus are for them, because they are very, very different and very specific. Now, in terms of the question of do I have a favorite framework, frankly, I think the world is in some ways overly obsessed with measurement frameworks. We've seen a proliferation of frameworks. A lot of them are basically from consultancies or organizations that need to keep raising money to keep developing frameworks. We've also recently seen a very helpful consolidation and alignment of those frameworks as everyone realized it was starting to become a barrier to the sector rather than an enabler. The lean data framework I really like because it forces the question of what's the minimum thing you need to measure in order to be sure that you're doing the right thing. And so using the lean data approach combined with a couple of very specific sub-bullets of the SDGs, and then some of the relevant metrics from IRIS or Jen or whoever you want to use, it's enough. And that is how you should present it to investors, that this is what you are going to measure, and that is how they should reward you. Some of the work that I do at the moment is actually providing catalytic funding to boost the money available to reach impact goals, knowing that it is harder to do those things and to take on the burden of measuring those things than it is to just do, a conventional business without any accountability on the other side. So just be as clear and granular as you can and use that lean data approach. And frankly, it's fine. And don't worry too much about the greenwashing or rainbow washing of corporates. They will be caught out. If they really aren't doing much, somebody will figure that out.
Okay, we're at 12:30. That is a lot of information that we're digesting. So if there's anyone that wants to pick up on anything that's just been said, don't worry, you will get the recording. I cannot wait to go for my jog and just listen to it all back later.
Oh, no.
This is all really, really good.
I'm never going to do that. It's horrifying.
Oh, no, I would never do that to my recordings. Are there any questions that have come up from the conversation so far, or anything you came into the meeting wanting to ask Ramona? There's no wrong questions. I had a question around the kind of the businesses that you've chosen to invest in or not to invest in, and wondered whether there were any entrepreneurs or businesses that you'd had the chance to invest in, you turned down at the time, and then later thought, oh shit, what have I done?
Yeah, ones that got away. I have a slightly different point of view on this. So it took a few years for me to develop my own investment thesis. So what I realized is I'm only really interested in certain areas. And a lot of those are around some of the complex systems, for example, nature-based solutions, and also the things that link climate and gender. There are other areas that, interest me academically, but not necessarily as an investor. For example, a lot of the stuff around material science. And what can be done. It is actually remarkable, some of the stuff that's being developed in the lab, for example, things like lab-grown meat or proteins. I'm not particularly interested as an investor in that, but I'm interested intellectually in it. So having said that, I don't have any where they pitched to me, I turned them down, and then I had regret. It was more that as an individual investor, I was always limited by how much money I had to invest at any given time. And that has been a real sadness for me, because I wish I were much richer than I am, because there are 3 or 4 businesses that I would have loved to invest in. At the moment when they pitched, I didn't have the cash and I missed my chance. There's a business called Apolitical, which is basically a knowledge and practice network for innovative civil servants. I know the founders well. I think they're amazing. I didn't have any cash when they pitched. I missed my window, right? Another business called Provenance, kind of blockchain certification for consumer and agricultural products. Same thing. I loved the business. I didn't have the cash. 2 months later, I'd missed my window. So it's that kind of thing that happens when I see a business that I love the thesis of. It's also the thing that actually made me switch from being an individual investor to try and changing the finance system, because I thought, I'm tapped out. I can't do anymore personally. So how else am I going to have an influence? So.
Yeah. And that's fantastic. Thank you, Ramona. And when you have walked away from an investment, what were the kind of red flags or warning signals that led you to not invest in that business?
Well, it's kind of funny, because if you invested early stage, the stage known as friends, family, and fools, the only thing that you can be sure of, or that you should assure yourself of, is the character and values of the founder or founders. That's it. It's actually not about the idea. It's not about the, other things are helpful. For example, timing. There's many, many businesses that come to the market just too early, and they end up taking a huge amount of cash and time just to keep going until things get better for them, either by changes in regulation or just people's consciousness, for example. But I'd say the one thing that is, for me, critical is to understand the why and the who. Because you can invest in a great idea, but if the founder isn't committed to it or isn't really true about their impact, then that's one thing. But if you've got someone who's truly driven, passionate, personally invested, they'll stay on it to make it work. And that's probably the best insurance that an investor can ever have.
Thank you. Okay, more questions from the audience.
I got another question.
Okay, for Alice.
I guess it's a product/value proposition related question. So we, just to give you an idea, we launched an MVP version of our platform, which is a corporate charity matching platform, and we use the SDGs to match them up. And we've done a couple of months of very intense testing and done a lot of interviews of that and surveys. And basically at the end of this testing period, what we realized is that there are 2 main streams that we can take to bring the product and, most importantly, the solution really to the next level. So I guess the question is, the doubt that we have right now is, which one do we take? Because while they're both in the same space, one is more towards still the matching with charities, matching charities and corporates, but in a very different way and through different means. And the other one is more around company's purpose and building the company's purpose. And so the kind of crossroad that we find ourselves at right now is, which one do we leverage? Which one do we kind of build our brand identity around? Which one do we go with? And because doing both would be probably complicated at an early stage. So I don't know, I just want to hear your thoughts on how we should be prioritizing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's good that you're asking yourself the tough question, which way do we go? Because to recognize that doing both would probably be difficult. But I wouldn't say that you have all the information yet to know which way to go, from what it sounds like. So I'd ask yourself a series of questions around this. So first of all, which way is less common? And if so, is that about a lack of demand, or is it about something that you've uncovered that could be a competitive advantage? Which way could be more profitable? Which way could be simpler for people to understand? Which way, so just like ask yourself a whole bunch of questions, and then if possible, run a low-cost experiment in 2 different environments, trying out one and then trying out the other, and see what you get from that. Don't commit until you feel fairly certain that you understand why you're committing. would be my suggestion. And I'm sorry, I don't know enough about the specifics, but just
no, it's perfect.
that helps a bit.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I just got delivered a cup of tea, by the way. So.
Oh, brilliant! You've got a great co-founder with you.
Well, he's actually running. It's funny. My husband is actually running a startup in the next room. 4 of them are pitching to an angel network tonight, and I'm a shareholder. And so this is
wow,
kind of hilarious. It's just
the proper innovation co-working space.
It really
is. I was just looking at some of the questions we get in our clinics, and one of them is around whether founders should put money in themselves if they're into the business themselves if they
yes.
And the question around whether you would be less inclined to invest in a business where the founders hadn't put any money in themselves. What are your feelings around that?
Yeah, I think some investors, forgive me for this, but they can be assholes around this, right? They're kind of often come from a position of wealth and privilege that says, well, if you haven't managed to somehow scrape up $100 grand, then you must not believe in your idea. I find that kind of thing really offensive because it assumes that everyone has wealth and privilege, and so it's a lousy proxy for founder commitment. And I also personally believe that if founders are starving, they're not going to do a very good job, like anyone would, of actually making sensible choices because they're going to be desperate. That's a terrible idea. So never, never, never put in money that you can't afford. And by the way, I never want to see another news story about somebody who maxed out their credit cards and ended up a billionaire. Like, screw that. It's the exception. It doesn't deserve to be talked about. So, don't look after yourself and your own welfare first. Do not put yourself at jeopardy or at risk. On the other hand, say to yourself, try and figure out what equivalent of commitment you can demonstrate. So, for example, if you get a group of people on your advisory board who are busy people, leaders in their field, that is a demonstration of your ability to command resources. If you are able to raise a bit of money from, your own immediate circle or from some of the grant pots that are available, that is also a good sign. So I don't think it's right to expect an investor to pick up the tab 100%, but nor do I think it is reasonable or ethical to expect a founder to bankrupt themselves in service of their idea. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, really, really good point. Thank you. And really important point. Carolina has asked, as is difficult to have clear the risk return impact relationship to in impact investment, how do you decide how much the return rate should be?
Right. Okay. So the good news for all of you is that the return rate from typical investments right now is bumping along close to 0, right? So basically, if you do better than 0, if you do better than setting cash on fire, you're actually in a good position. That has not always been the case, and it is not the case everywhere in the world because, in many places, the expected interest rate is 15, 17, 21%. But right now, it's like nothing. So the good news is that you should all be definitely able, I feel very confident in saying this, be able to return better than nothing. The question is over what time frame? Because what an investor has to think about is, I'm putting my money in for the next 10 years. So what do I expect to have at the end, of this? Do I expect to have the same amount? Do I expect to have a little more? Is it okay to actually have a little bit less because I would have done even worse keeping the money in cash or under the bed? Think like an investor would. Having said that, most impact venture funds would probably put their expected portfolio return rate, so not just for one business, but for everything they invest in, depending on the sector, at somewhere between 3.5% at the very concessional end of the market, which is kind of like really expecting a higher failure rate or understanding that it is a market failure. If I invest in civic tech, for example, there isn't yet a functioning market, so I might pitch it at the 3.5 to 5% end. But in renewable energy, you already have a highly functioning market where the costs have really come down. So return rates is somewhere between 15 and 18% IRR, the sort of rate of return, internal rate of return on your cash is up there in the high double digits. It is interesting to see that a number of funds, because you can't really look at this at a per company, you have to really look at a fund or a basket of these things. The sustainable funds outperformed last year by a significant margin the sort of classic funds. A lot of that had to do with oil and gas and its collapse out of the S&P 500 and so on. So again, like, I think it's wise for you to equip yourselves with the expected, ask an investor, what is the expected IRR of your so-called impact fund? And if they tell you 3-4%, you know you're dealing with proper kind of social investors, patient investors. If they tell you 14 to 18, they're pretty much mainstream. And there's everything in the middle. And also go read like the fund annual reports of social impact funds, people like Bridges, Impact Ventures, people who actually invest in things like social housing or the big issues, big society capital. Like, have a look at theirs and see what their IRRs are and understand whose investment thesis do you fit and why. It's really the best way to get around this particular question.
Jeru has a question around certifications like Corp and their importance in the mind of investors.
Yeah.
And B Corp, sorry.
Yeah. I figured you did.
You get it. It's fine.
If I carry a designer handbag into a meeting, it does tell you something. But if I'm not carrying a designer handbag into a meeting, all it tells you is I haven't spent money on a designer handbag. The reason I'm saying this is I don't think, so sorry, I'll take one little excursion. My financial advisors are a B Corp. They're not particularly ethical, and most of their funds, as I pointed out to them, are actually in the lowest grade of by share action of responsibility that is there. So it doesn't mean a huge amount. And if you're relatively early in your journey, you might focus on very, very specific measures like ISO certifications rather than something like a B Corp that takes a ton of time and money, might tie you up to things that actually aren't that relevant or helpful at the early stage and so on. So I would personally favor looking for industry-specific markers of quality than just a kind of generic tick in the box of like, we're a social business. To me, things like B Corp are actually there to try and whitewash, ordinary businesses and make them feel good. I'm not saying they're bad things. I'm just saying that their process and their costs are there as an industry and of themselves that may not necessarily be appropriate for a startup.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Drew. Just going back to the chat, there's a question around grants, and there was a point that Arta made around the fact that most VCs are looking for 30 times in 5 years, just looking at pitch decks. I think that was off the back of your...
No, they're not. No, they're not. Again, look at the fund. Don't look at the actual fund reporting. When you can see what people have promised their investors. It's there in black and white. It is typically, venture funds will typically say that they're looking for high double-digit or top quartile returns, but top quartile is 16 to 18%. Like, it's just the math. There's a lot of hot air in this sector as well. So don't believe everything people claim.
Thank you for speaking to that point. And then there's one question around grants. So quite a generic question, but kind of how can you find grants?
How long have you find grants? Oh, have I got time to write a book? Okay, so there's probably 3 kinds of grants you want to be aware of. One of those, which is hard to get as a very early stage startup, but is possible sometimes, are things like Innovate UK. They run a series of topic-specific grant competitions during the course of a given year. They're all advertised on the Innovate UK website. They are typically for technical or scientific innovation, but not exclusively. So, for example, they did do an SDG innovation challenge in 2 parts last year. So that's one route. The second is, depending on the sector that you are in, there are often foundations that have programs of work that are specifically geared against particular challenges or issues. So the IKEA Foundation or the Lemelson Foundation, or like there are hundreds of foundations out there, and each of them, the Soros Foundation, Open Society Foundation, supports journalism. Jeff Bezos's Climate Fund supports climate activism and journalism. So, in your given sector, find out which foundations give grants and have a look at their calls and see if you qualify. And then the third is actually things like small business grants, entrepreneurial grants. There's a lot of that stuff knocking around because obviously doing the maths, governments know we need more innovation and more people to start businesses up. So just do your homework is really the only thing I can advise. I mean, this stuff is all out there on the internet. It's just that it takes some digging around. And also think about what you want a grant for. You're not going to get a grant to pay for your salary. You could get a grant to pay for a piece of research or technical development, most likely, that you need to advance your business.
Thanks. We have a question that is probably not relevant to everyone, but and I suggest as if that you bring this up kind of separately in more detail with Ramona in one of the one-to-one clinics, but just for just to answer this maybe in a kind of a top level way. He's asking, since you mentioned that you have an academic interest in material science, and beyond lab-grown protein, do you see any major developments which the clothing and accessories industry is seeing in terms of materials?
That is very specific. And I to be fair, I don't really look at clothing materials. I tend to look at things like circular economy solutions or things that influence climate smart agriculture. So to give you two examples that have caught my eye recently, I was part of I am part of an accelerator group called Innovators for the Future. There's a company called Bioplaster Research in Mexico that is basically using a pesky fungus that comes in and disrupts the local sort of seafront and turning it into a building material. I just think things like that are extremely smart, and they're often very, very local. They're climate smart. They're, they're about local employment and so on. But I'm also very interested in some of the advances that try in agroecology. There's a firm called Atmonia. And this is fabulously nerdy. They make locally. You can manufacture ammonia or an ammonia equivalent for fertilizer on your farm very cheaply, so that you don't have to have either the transport costs or the environmentally damaging costs of most classic ammonia. So I think things like that are super, super, super interesting. But I'm a little bit less close on the clothing side. I mean, my viewpoint there is just buy much less and keep it a lot longer. She says having a big hole in her jeans that are now 3 years old and have been worn almost entirely through this quarantine. My quarantine jeans, I like to call them.
That could start trending, that one. Okay, I know we've only got a few questions left. Salma, welcome. Missed the first part, so apologies if this has been mentioned before. At a very early stage, how do you manage all the uncertainty when creating good, realistic timelines, milestones, and commercialization? Great question for these times.
Very good question. Yeah, as if one didn't need enough uncertainty. You're all starting a startup right about now. I salute you. Speaking as a kind of investor who sees a lot of stuff, I don't expect ever the numbers in any plan to be right. I definitely don't. They're always going to be wrong. That's rule number one. But what I do want to see is how an entrepreneur thinks about their plans. Are they clear? Are they based on some kind of proxy for reality? Do they make sense? So for example, I'll tell you one of my classic red warning light things, which is when I look at the end of year 2, beginning of year 3, and boom, the business takes off like a rocket ship. All of a sudden it's doubling every month and the profit is increasing and it's fantastic. There is no reason why that would happen at that particular moment other than someone has said you must be cash positive in year 3. That's clearly lunacy. So while I expect the numbers to be wrong, I also expect them to be reasonable. At least in their logic. I expect the framework of the numbers to be reasonable. So if you want to try and manage uncertainty, make it as simple as possible. Most businesses are actually pretty simple. They have customers, they have costs, and they have other stuff that could make things harder or easier. So just boil it down as much as you can and then revisit it every month or so and say what's changing. And by the way, the other thing to do is to use comparables. If there's a business that you feel is similar to yours, but a bit further along, just basically borrow their logic because they will have learned something that's helpful. I hope that helps.
It definitely does. Thanks, Salma. Really nice to see you. Jury would love to stay in touch with you, Ramona, as I'm sure everyone else in this.
I'm here. I'm yours for the year, LJ. No,
and that's basically what she's going to be doing as an Entrepreneur-in-Residence. A whole host of different events we'll be having with Ramona. She's going to be offering us advisory services, support, mentorship. She's going to be judging, and so we're super excited about the rest of the year. Who said 2021 looked shit? I just wanted to let you know that we're going to be having some one-on-one clinics with Ramona over the next few weeks. So in answer to your question, Drew, you can absolutely stay connected. We'll be sending out a form. I'll send it to everyone that has attended here, and we'll be promoting it on socials for you to fill in some questions that you might have for Ramona, and then we'll schedule you in a session with her. So I'll probably end on that note, because I know that Ramona has to jump into another meeting, and it is indeed Friday. I'm sure you've got loads of places to go, but please do stay in contact. As I said, the recording is happening now, and I'll make that available to all of you, so you can just kind of swat off on everything that has been discussed. Guys, thank you so much for your questions. They were absolutely brilliant. I can always...
Yeah, they're wonderful questions, and congratulations to everyone who is building a business in the teeth of this time. And I hope, that we're able to provide as much support to you as we can through this sort of virtual love fest.
Absolutely, it's a virtual love fest. That's what that's the strap line of this session. But guys, as Ramona said, take care of yourselves. We can't wait to see you again soon. Follow us on Instagram, because you'll get all of the updates on the events that we're running with Ramona and others as well. And apart from that, have a lovely weekend, and good luck with all your business building. Take care. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.